Cultural Studies. He is Professor of Cultural Studies and Head of Center for Culture and Religious Studies at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And his main areas of research include Central European and Balkan political ideologies, subcultures, and graffiti culture, but also collective memory and post-socialist nostalgia. Professor Velikonja has published extensively on these topics and has written a string of fascinating books that I warmly recommend for everyone to read. And today's lecture is entitled Poetry After Srebrenica, a cultural reflection on the Yugoslav 1980s. And Mitja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anita, for this nice introduction. Thanks, Annika, for inviting me. Unfortunately, this time coincides precisely with the topic of today's talk. So what to do, how to react as an artist and as a scholar after the terrible, political and catastrophic events that are happening here and now. They are not just some past event, that we would like to, leave somewhere behind, but as you see, is going on. So I'm going to present a topic today that it was in my mind for a long time. I was preparing for this particular research for a long time, and it took me quite some years, maybe more than 10. I was interested in how the 80s in Yugoslavia are reflected in post-Yugoslav cultural and artistic landscape. So how art and culture in a way construct this last decades of socialist Yugoslavia. There are two main reasons for that. The first one is because it fits into my general academic interest. For a long time, I'm researching cultural dynamics and mostly cultural resistance in the post-socialist and post-Yugoslav transition, which is decisively, the whole area is decisively shaped by two leading ideologies and political practices, and this is neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism. The second reason is kind of autobiographic. I was also an 80s kid, intellectually and subculturally grown in this decade. So 80s for me were very intense and formative decade. A small anecdote from my life. I was defending my BA thesis on the exact day when the first Slovenian multi-party government was formed back in 1990. So I have lived and personal experience, but also broader kind of academic view on both the 80s and everything what came after the 80s. My presentation is based on a chapter that was recently published just a few weeks ago in this book. It's an edited volume, a collection of texts of different scholars, mostly historians from the region and also from abroad, that are dealing with the late Yugoslavia. It was first published in Serbian language, and now it is in print also in English language. So those of you who will be interested in it will be available on also online. It's a like copyleft approach. But I will start, the inspiration for today's talk is this particular graffiti that appeared in Ljubljana, in then Yugoslavia, and now Slovenia, more than 30 years ago. This photo is from the late 80s, and the last one is from few weeks ago. So, it's almost the same. Everything around this graffiti changed. There are also some, as you can see, slight modifications, but this image, this picture in a way remains. And I believe that this is a good starting point of my topic today. So I would start with the research question that I posed myself. They are, as you see, very, very broad. That I posed myself, before going more deeply into this research, into this topic that interested me, as I said, even before. So how do we understand the Yugoslav 80s today? By meaning today is from 1991 on. So how people write about them, paint them, write poems, make music and so on, sing about them. So how the 80s are present today in post-Yugoslav republics, so physically, but also in the digital world, which, as you well know, is very present when we're speaking about the construction of the past. So how do we value them in the arts and culture after the bloody tale of the 1990s? Bloody tale is a reference to a famous poem by a Serbian poet Desanka Maksimovic, Bloody Tale, speaking about the previous war, the Second World War. Or referring to Adorno, which was also, again, one of my academic inspirations for this talk, can we still write poetry on the last Yugoslav decade after what happened in Srebrenica, in Ahmići, in Vukovar, in Dubrovnik, in hundreds of other killing fields, or it is too barbaric as well? So I'm interested in, and I'm still interested, I'm still following, an article came out of it, a chapter, but it's a kind of ongoing research for the two reasons that I mentioned before. So I'm interested in various types of artistic and cultural representations of the last Yugoslav decade after it collapsed in 1991. I immediately faced two problems. It's difficult to isolate this last Yugoslav decade from the previous ones. So from the 1945 on, there were oscillations, of course, ups and downs. Liberal years, decades, more autocratic, even totalitarian in the beginning, So it was kind of still one kind of entity, very diverse, but still one. But it's very easy to separate them from the next decade. Yugoslavia collapsed, 6, 7 countries emerged from it, it ended up in a bloody war, and now in the new status that was for some decades quite different, and this is becoming a periphery of the Europe and the developed world. So we find continuity on one side and discontinuity on the other. This reflects, as we'll see later on through the cases, this reflects also in this cultural and artistic representations of that decade. The second problem that I faced is that this is extremely wide and diverse topic. I know that my ambition was too big maybe, and I covered it as much as I could in these years. Because I was trying to find the most important, the most, also popular and publicly discussed artworks, and cultural artifacts in the last 3 decades that were referring to Yugoslavia. So my research fields were, as you can see, from literature, poetry, to online representations, film, of course, popular and consumer culture. So this is how the consumer culture, so mainstream in a way, appropriated the 80s, subcultures, retrospectives, exhibitions, and so on and so on. So this is really a huge amount of different fields to research. So, but I was starting, it took me some years to accomplish what I planned, first passively and then actively and then very focused. I was reading dozens of books, watching all kinds of shows and videos and films and so on, and quite some time to summarize. So it was extremely difficult to put all these differences in one piece on these 20-25 pages that were later published on, or that are now presented in 40 minutes or so. One of the anchors of my research is this quote from Maša Kolanović. Maša Kolanović is an excellent Croatian comparativist that says fiction in general has no ambition to provide complete or privileged truth, but rather works in a space which there is a plurality of truth. So there is no one big truth with a capital T, but the truth is, I'm here referring again to Adorno, in a piece, in a detail, in interpretation. So this is a starting point also from the theoretical perspective to my presentation today. So again, doing artistic cultural reflections and reinventions of the Yugoslav 80s within a wider frame, ideological hegemony and political practices of neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism. So completely different from the previous ideological hegemony and political practices of socialism, so neoliberalism instead of socialism, and multiculturalism, the Yugoslav version, brotherhood and unity, bratstvo, jedinstvo, so ethno-nationalism. So complete turn of the ideological perspective and also the concrete political practices. Just in these days, late February, there's 30 years of the one event in one terrible event in Slovenian history, present Slovenian history, and this is the erasure of about 25,000 people from Slovenia. This was so-called the erased incident that took place in the February 1992. So this is a kind of black stain in the recent history of Slovenia, and also many of the art pieces that I will present reflect this shameful event. What are these reflections and reinventions? How they look like? The most mechanic division will be that they are affirmative, so sweet, balanced, bittersweet, and negative. But let's turn first to the mainstream interpretation of the 90s. In the majority of the post-Yugoslav dominant discourses and institutions, so Althusserian ideological apparatus of the state, so school curriculum, mass media, pop culture, official historiography, memory politics, there's a kind of demonization of Yugoslavia, rejection, ignorance, amnesia at best. So they are decisively anti-Yugoslav and anti-socialist. We are experiencing kind of exorcism of everything that was socialist and everything that was Yugoslav. Especially in the first year, the first decade, we'll see later how it's developed in this long or short 30 years. It depends. And of course, in different degrees, in different new states differently, but still, there's a kind of general feeling that this was, a terrible time, that respective nations were, of course, the ones who suffered most, and that was 45 years of total authoritarian regime, and so on and so on. So Yugoslavia was something bad, Yugophobia. So no wonder that the most prolific genre in the region are memoirs of the political protagonists, or in the language of memory studies, memory entrepreneurs. And they are divided in two groups. The first one, those who lost Yugoslavia. So about dissolution, Raif Dizdarević, the last president of the presidency of Yugoslavia, Borislav Jović, Kadijević, and others. And the second group is about liberation, those who gained, the winners of transition, if I may use this terrible language at the end, like Stipe Mesić, Martin Špegel, Jan Šarupel in Slovenia, Izetbegović, and others. So this is one side. The other side is very, very different. It seems like, like in Freudian return of the repressed. So uncritical images of the sweet 80s. So almost complete opposite. This is becoming increasingly present, increasingly appreciating, and increasingly mainstream, as we'll see later on. The further we go from the 80s, the more prettified image appears, but not exclusively. This dominant negative image still remains, but you will see that it becomes much, much more complex than before. So on the other side, in pop culture, it started, of course, in alternative culture, but then it also moved to pop culture and other levels. We find Yugophilia, so positive image of Yugoslavia. And let's go, to see on which field it appears. Ana Petrov, fantastic sociologist of memory from Belgrade, mostly on the musical field. She speaks about the pop musicians from different parts of Yugoslavia as the great pacifiers of the region. So even during the most terrible years, early and late 90s, they were able, some of them, to also spread the pacifistic idea, the multicultural idea, also to other parts of not only in their countries, but also in other parts of ex-Yugoslavia. So there are old, like eternal bands that are having big success still, those from Yugoslav times, referring in their songs, referring in their image, referring in their attitude, to the 80s. Then there are new Yugo-nostalgic bands, mostly referring again, to this, sweet, decadent, decade 80s. Also, some other important events from and periods from Yugoslav past, like partisan liberation and others, but mostly they are focusing on the 80s. We'll see later on. So this Dionysian period of the late Yugoslavia. So from Novi Fosili, which were kind of Slovenia, which were kind of Yugoslav ABBA, they were called, this photo on the extreme left side. For Good Old Times, it was the title of one of their famous songs, and also the name of one of many tours that they had, the last tours, every 2-3 years, in Yugoslavia, in ex-Yugoslavia. Then Pankrti, the punk band, or Laibach, that you know very well. They formed, even in times of Yugoslavia, from late 70s on, they formed a kind of, very, how to say, bottom-up definition of Yugoslav culture through pop, through rock. They formed, in the quite precise words of Ante Perković, a Croatian musicologist, Seventh Republic. Yugoslavia consisted of six republics and 2 autonomous provinces, and the Yugoslav rock was the Seventh Republic. And we can have a discussion about it, but I believe it's quite justified. Secondly, that the whole genre of music studies, collections, biographies, and so on about the 80s appeared. Punk of the 80s, New Wave, Belgrade Spring, celebrating now for last year 40 years, of this one famous album, important personalities, and so on, and so on. I'll show later some images. Then there are 2 TV programs, both based in Croatia. One is called Classic TV, and this is how they present themselves: a meeting place of regional films, not Yugoslavia, not post-Yugoslavia. They are using some neutral words like Adriatic region or Danube region, in this case, region, like a region, but everyone knows what it means by region. It's not the whole Balkans, it's not Bulgaria, it's not Romania, it's not Greece. The Balkans is Yugoslavia in this context. And Yugoton TV. Yugoton was one of the, now it's Croatia Records, of course. It was the company that produced, that made the records from the 60s on. Everyone listened to Yugoton records. And again, they present themselves national music television that shows music clips from the past times. And if you watch these two programs, most of the films, most of the videos, most of the talk shows are referring to this last decade of Yugoslavia. Then there are in TV shows, there are some shows of golden moments of Yugoslav sports, and in different radio stations in different parts of ex-Yugoslavia. When I'm traveling, I'm listening to local radios always, and I'm hearing from time to time, today it's an 80s show, let's go back to the 80s, blah, blah. So this is one part, of the whole program. Also, let's go back to the 80s. There's a local story about it, local interpretation. There's also a broader one, but this will wait for a few minutes more. Then there are new, when it comes to movies and TV series, they are much more reserved toward Yugoslavia, much more complex, much less enthusiastic, less carnivalesque. Also moving to, I don't know, tragedies of those times. Here I'm mentioning Andrej Košak's film Outsider, about the early punk scene in Slovenia. Srđan Dragojlović, his films also refer to the 80s. Rajko Grlić, Goran Kulenović made a TV series, Crno-beli svet, the black and white world. The title is the same as the title of the song of Croatian new wave band Prljavo kazalište, Dirty Theater, and they took this title, and it's a TV show that speaks about the 80s, the good and bad times in the 80s. Then Iza Sheregian and others. Here are some examples to get a little bit of idea about it. So the second image here on the top are rock partizani, like partisans and those who party. Here with stereotypical Yugoslav, personalities, from, like a partisan commander there, a sportsman, a mafia guy, and a hypersexualized, as you see, pioneer girl, which were of course little girl from 7 to 13. Then what I mentioned before, 40 years of the new wave in Yugoslavia. It's a collection of albums that appeared in the early 80s, both in Croatia and in Serbia, so in Zagreb and in Belgrade. So the brotherhood and unity still exist in one way or another. Then the new wave from Rijeka. Rijeka is a small town in the port in northern Croatia, which is a very strong, very vibrant cultural, artistic, and punk and new wave scene. And this is an anthology, a book, and a collection of really fantastic footage on the DVD and also songs. Then in the lower line, these are these two TV programs. So classic TV, and Jugoton. Then there's an image, a photo from the film that I mentioned before, Outsider, that ends up in the beginning of the 80s with the death of Tito in May 1980, a tragic story, and Crno-beli svet, black and white world, here on the extreme right. Then to go on, to continue, there are many rock documentaries or commentaries about punk and new wave scene that appeared, or rock scene in general, about crucial bands. I'll mention a little later on some examples of it. But this cultural virus of the 80s moved also to the internet and Facebook, Instagram, and so on and so on. I will show you later on the screenshot of the Facebook group called 80s in Zagreb, 80 u Zagrebu. From 2014, it had, as I checked last time, about 38,000 members. Then we see slowly we are moving more and more to mainstream. It is appearing increasingly, from early 2000s, so in the last 21, 22 years, also in the consumer culture, in tourism. There are nostalgic weekends in supermarkets when you can buy, products from old brands. Again, most of them, were popular in the 80s. Nostalgic bars, restaurants, places, and so on. When you see how they are decorated, again, most of the artifacts are coming, from this last decade of Yugoslavia. In fashion and design, again, return of the retro aesthetic. 80s became part of the hipster culture. Again, there's a local story and there's a broader story. We'll come to this a little bit later on. And an important element of this return to the 80s are exhibitions, retrospectives, overviews, and so on very different things. I would divide them in two big groups about Yugoslav visual arts and design and films, so more artistic part, and examples like 80s through the prism of the events, exhibition, and discourses in Modern Gallery in Ljubljana some years ago. Or these are even more attended exhibitions about everyday life in Yugoslavia. The most important example was 80s, 80 the sweet decadence of the last decade. This was in Zagreb. Then Life Was Never Better, very, very interesting title, that toured Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Ljubljana. I will again show some examples. This is the screenshot of this Yugo Nostalgia group from Zagreb, Facebook group from Zagreb, one of many. Then you see not only local supermarkets, but also those who are owned by by foreigners. They use this element of nostalgia for mostly products from the 70s and 80s. The one that I still remember vividly, but this is something very new, as it is the case with the retro culture for the younger generation. Then retro in costume design, in clothes, as you see on the extreme right in the first row. This is Laka, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a Sarajevo-based band. Then the exhibitions that I mentioned, so the sweet decadence of the postmodernity, 80s in Zagreb. Again, this would not be possible. You see, this was shown in 2015. This could not be shown in 2005, even less in 1995. And the two on the right side, lower line, are from Ljubljana. So the new spaces, new images, 80s through the prism of events, and the very, very attended exhibition, although it was for more for art than for everyday culture. And the last the last field that I would like to mention is, I'm starting here again with this famous Adorno's quote, is literature. So again, personal and social happenings, very often autobiographical, strongly reflect the temporal and spatial framework. So this chronotype of late Yugoslavia is very, very much present in all of these works that I'm mentioning here, and many, 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 many others. I just made here a kind of selection of those who I found most interesting, more symptomatic as well. The first group is the books that are dealing mostly with the 80s. You see, from Radakovic to Nere Karadzic, Closing Time in Sarajevo. Especially few of them, like Radakovic, Vujicic, Rizvanovic, they're speaking about the field that I mentioned before, so youth playing in punk bands, going around, making graffiti and so on. So kind of sex and drugs and Red Stars literature. Very, very strong, very persuasive, because it's mostly, as I said, autobiographical, but with a strong historical and social background. It's not some isolated story. None of these books, for example, Leila Karamuic, little girl grown in Sarajevo, her coming out later on, but showing how the things were going on in Sarajevo in the 80s. The second part, the second half, is their stories. The narration goes in the 80s, but starts before and then continues later on. From fantastic books, Darko Cvijetic, Schindler's Elevator, no Schindler's List, but Schindler's Elevator, to Sebastian Pregel's In Elvis' Room, published in Slovenia recently. In many of these cases, there's a lot of humor. Some of these books are really like a comedy. You have a good time reading them, but in many of them, there's kind of idea, this how to say, feeling of approaching kind of shade of terrible times, catastrophe approaching, so this is also one of the common things in this literature, and broader in this cultural and artistic interpretation of the 80s in general. So Romana Klev, like a fictional rendering of the actual events and persons, and I'm showing here some examples from Sjaj Epohe, which was written in the beginning of the 90s already, to Zovite me Esteban, the Leila Karamuic that I mentioned before. Then important Somrak Idolo of Aleš Debeljak, translated in, I believe, 12 or 13 languages. Unfortunately, a hit. Unfortunately, because it speaks about these terrible things. Fantastic book, 2 essays in one book. Then Lexicon U Mythologia, again, written in a very amusing, funny way, like a lexicon of U mythology of Yugoslavia, written by different authors. And this was the first book, I believe it was published in 2003 or 2004, the first book that was published simultaneously in Zagreb and in Belgrade. So again, the book that connected people on a symbolic level with this book. And Hardfuckers, the graphic novel of fantastic Slovenian painter. He actually is a painter, Zoran Smiljanic. Vittorio della Croce is his nickname. So not to be too long, let's see what there are some kind of, if there are some recognizable common characteristics in all this variety ocean of different things that we saw. Of course, there are much more differences, but still I see some commonality, some things that can be recognized as kind of very wide but still structure of all these artifacts. First, that the cultural and artistic trips to the 80s are part of global retromania trend. Here I'm referring to the term invented by Simon Reynolds. He is a musical journalist and writer, excellent writer. Now he's based in LA, I believe, but he's from London, following what was going on in British music and then in American music, living there from the 80s on. So he's speaking about these re-decades from 2000 on, 2010s, now 2020s. We are going just So he's speaking about re-decades, kind of retromania. So everything that is happening here is part of this global retromania trend on one side. So this is part of the global story. But let's see how this functions also from within. This kind, so what is the more local reason for that kind of obsession with the 80s in culture and arts in the last decades? So there's a specificity in the Yugoslav 80s, kind of contradiction, economic and political decline slowly from, you know, the first death, the death of Tito in May 1980, and to the death of Yugoslavia in June 1991. You know, so there was a slow but, you know, firm decline. On the other side, the 80s were kind of creative, were the time of creative explosion in the cultural and artistic field. And this is no surprise, you know, that most of these interpretations of the past refer more on the 80s than on previous decades. The sole exception is, of course, the partisan liberation from 41 to 40 to 45, which is again a kind of a very shining moment in the history of Yugoslavia. So before, you know, 70s, you know, in Yugoslavia, if you stay a little bit more with this specifics of the Yugoslav 80s, the 70s were so-called lead 70s, you know, the return of the old boys, as this was called, you know, so more tight decade, you know, after the defeat of the liberals in the late 60s and early 70s. 70s were very, very quiet and boring and very, very also more repressive than the decade before or after. And so the 80s are in this position between the lead, quiet 70s and bloody, you know, terrible 90s. So it was really, you know, something to remember, this short period, a very, very strong, very, very vibrant on many of these levels, and in many others, of course. You know, I'm here concentrating only on arts and culture. So that was really a kind of, you know, the 80s were kind of swan song of Yugoslavia, the last decade, and this remains, as we see, in a very positive memory also in these reinterpretations. Then we can speak about double 80s. This is also extremely important to point out, not only in this discussion, but in discussions about the transition in post-Yugoslavia, and especially in Slovenia, that are going on now. So in the first were happier half of the 80s, more optimistic half, you know, the sprout of new subcultures, late 70s and mostly early 80s, blossoming on different levels, punk, gay, lesbian, feminist, ecologist, you know, independent writers, and so on. So kind of new lifestyles, you know, it was much, much more optimistic. And the second half, you know, so from the 86, 87 on became much more sober, much more bitter, depressing, because the collapse was becoming to be more and more evident. There was a rise of economic, political, ethnic tensions. The first violence appeared, and so on and so on. So actually, there are these double 80s, and this also reflects in the pieces, in the art pieces, and in the interpretations that I mentioned before. Then these representations are located between trauma and nostalgia. They are not two different things, but they coexist in conflict in the feeling of mourning. So I'll move my head. Do you see? So mourning is behind my head. But they don't remain there. This is extremely important. I would like to mention that this is something that is just a kind of starting point of the new after Yugoslav life. So life after death of Yugoslavia, if I may be a little bit morbid now. So it's not the fatalistic end of the story. Usually the narration continues after the 1991. We did not forget. We did not fall into this new crazy rise of nationalism and blah blah. But still, we still remember positive things from back then. There are two breaks in a way, two breaks in spatial and two ends, two breaks. So before and after 1991. In many of these works, from songs, films to literature, to poetry, end of youth coincides with the end of Yugoslavia. Goodbye Teens, as it goes, one song of Plavi Orchestra, the Blue Orchestra, one of the famous pop bands from Yugoslavia, Goodbye Teens, coincides with Goodbye Yugoslavia. So this is also very, very important, linking the two personal and so intimate, personal, and everything that comes with this part with the global developments. or political and others. Then there's different. Here I'm referring to two authors, very, very inspiring, Trifonova and Kolanovic, who pointed out that they are very different, speaking very general terms about Eastern Europe in general. But I can easily, locate this also in ex-Yugoslavia. So there are different images of the 80s in different decades. Of course, there are very lot of differences, but still, there are some main points. In 90s, strong revisionism, and in Yugoslavia, particularly because of this very radical politics and conflicts and even wars, this revisionism was really, from black to white, or from red to black, if I may be more precise. Then after 2000s, kind of bittersweet nostalgia appears. From 2010s on, Yugoslavia appears kind of historical curiosity. This was at that time. How could you survive without internet? Oh, their telephones were not everywhere, Then these things, so vegetarians did not exist at that time, and so on. So it's kind of, curiosity from recent history that, the older people still remember. It's not buried there in the past, but it's still kind of present in one way or another. And we saw also from the popular culture and other fields that I mentioned before, the 80s are still persistent, are still there. But now, in 2020s, in the desert of post-socialism, if I may refer to this famous book of Stix and Horvat, people are starting to discovering or even appreciating revolutionary and emancipative potentials, political potentials of those decades, starting, of course, where else than, in the fields where, that I mentioned a few times already, radical art, cultural alternatives, workers and students' revolts. This is extremely important, to point out. Progressive subcultures, sub-politics, new subcultures, emancipative movements, and so on and so on. They are referring, not on Yugoslavia as such, as a whole, but on some elements that were, especially in the 90s, quite appealing also for the situation, for the condition that we are having now. And last two common characteristics is that it is created mostly by the last Yugoslav generation, the generation that was young at that time, or that was coming into power in the 80s, who experienced from close distance or on their skin cultural blossoming on one side and political disintegration of Yugoslavia on the other. So it's kind of trans-realist genre, again, from songs, poems to film, when some biographical and autobiographical bits can be found in their fiction. And the last common characteristic would be that throughout these works, or most of them, authors developed kind of personal and social resistance. They projected it to back then, to the 80s, and in a way linking them to what is going on now. This experience of rapture also hides the seed of revolt. So I don't see this generation who created this music, films, documentaries, books, and so on as the last Yugoslav generation, but not lost Yugoslav generation. And this is, in my view, also the political element of this kind of production. So if we can speak now, I'm using Bitnik's vocabulary about the poetry in jeans, painter in jeans, prose, music, and so on. Back then, wearing jeans, kind of rebellion toward the older generation, they're wearing it also now in opposition to this neo-traditional turn that is happening all over Eastern Europe and also in ex-Yugoslavia, this neo-folklorism. So jeans were, in fashion for them back then, and also now, if I may point out this little element of it. So to conclude, not to, just enough. Now I'm returning to initial Adorno's dilemma. So can we at least try to write after Auschwitz, after Srebrenica, and other tragedies of the 20th century? Here I'm referring to an author, American poet, Charles Reznikov, who wrote, and most of these authors are doing exactly the same thing. So to quote him, doing what the artist has always done and finding the appropriate technical means. So in most of these works, of course, again, I took into consideration so many of them, and in some of them there's no trace of them, but in the most radical, the one who are most critical, the most, how to say, edgy, they are just not just cultural inspirations or ideas or aesthetic preferences and so on, but, and this is, I'm referring to the last characteristic that I mentioned before, also the seeds of social dissent. I did not agree what was going on back then, but I also don't agree what is happening now. Or, you know, the idea sometimes in the background is this we fought for? Is this is what we, you know, spat at the system, you know, that we have what is going on now? So this criticism in a way remains, and this is, in my view, you know, very political element of this kind of production, because, you know, because of the experience from those times, and also, you know, being very, very cautious of what is going on here and now. And I'm concluding with a verse from one of my favorite bands, Mitja Velikonja. In every defeat, I saw a part of freedom, and when I'm done, that's when it really begins. So all these works, of course, it's a big difference with among them, you know, but in my view, they still offer not only cultural and artistic, but also political relevant otherness to what is going on now in post-Yugoslav situation, of course, in different parts in different way, but still, you know, very, very, very different from what was expected, you know, in the 80s. At that time, you know, the illusion of better future, you know, was very, very much present, although, you know, everything, you know, in economic and political and also ethnic situation, you know, was deteriorating, you know, but still no one expected that things will turn as they turn from 90s on. So kind of hidden message in all this, or most of them, or more radical of them, you know, works is that if the alternative existed back then in times of Yugoslavia, outside and inside the state framework, so it exists also now. And that's why I believe, you know, this is kind of really emancipatory. It's got a lot of emancipatory potentials, and I believe it can function also in this way in the present day condition. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Anita, are you chairing the questions and answers?
Yes, of course. And Diana, I think you had a question. I think I saw you first.
Hi, hello. Yes, not really a question. I was just really appreciating your talk. Thank you very much, Mitja. It all sounds, you know, in lots of ways familiar and also very interesting. And I come from film studies, and basically what my very immediate question is a very, you know, kind of specific one. Can you give us a film title, for example, of that reacts in this way, like it shows this kind of I don't know, new attitude, this kind of potential for emancipatory potential, or is it closer to kind of nostalgic views? And I'm telling you why I'm asking this, like, is going to be like this nostalgia present in film as well? Like recently in Estonia, a film came out and it's called Goodbye Soviet Union. And it has all these wonderful elements of color, you know, it's like, it's not this the usual drab and gray imagery of the past, but it's very colorful. And yeah, in many ways, your talk reminded me of that film. So I was wondering if you have an example in the Yugoslav context. Thank you very much, former Yugoslav.
Thank you. No, I believe, you know, that also nostalgia, you know, nostalgia is, again, you know, a kind of umbrella term, you know, it can be sentimental, it can be also very emancipative, you know. And in Yugoslavia, I was doing field work back in 2008, 2009. I was 2 summers in Bosnia and Herzegovina doing, you know, all kind of, you know, using all kind of methods, you know. There, you know, the resistance toward the nationalism and ethno-liberalism still speaks through Yugoslav language, you know. There, you know, Yugo nostalgia is still very, you know, it's a kind of left opposition to what is going on then. In some other parts of ex-Yugoslavia, it's not. It took some also different shapes, you know. But Yugo nostalgia can be also a strong, you know, emancipatory weapon. If also on a political level, you know, this, you know, they're having clubs, you know, pressure groups, and so on, you know. But speaking about the films, I would point out, I don't know, Outsider, the film of Andrei Košak from the 1997, for example. And then this TV series, Black and White World, you know, who again, you know, speaks about all, you know, the nice times and also troubles, you know, and approaching end of Yugoslavia, you know, you know, through the life of a very, you know, middle class, you know, Zagreb family, very, you know. So these are, I believe, two examples, you know, who are showing what I was trying to say. There are also some more negative, or how to say, more fatalistic images of this. I mean, here by Dragoljevich film, Pretty Village, Pretty Flame, Lepa Sela, Lepo Gore, and Rane, Wounds, you know, when, you know, it seems that it was doomed from, if not from the beginnings, then from the 80s, from the 70s on, you know, so everything just went, and it happened what was already there in a way, you know, so more pessimistic view, you know. But these two films that I mentioned, you know, I believe could be answered to your question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have another question from Maria. Please, Maria, go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk as well. I'm a big fan of your Tito Stalta book as well, so thank you. It was nice to have this talk in English, because I think the chapter you're talking about is not available in English yet, is it?
It will be. Now it's in print. It is in English. It's already translated, you know, and it was translated, I believe, yes, also in Hungarian and in Slovenian recently. So it's, but it will be in English, you know. So, you know, Czech Helsinki Committee of Serbia, they have everything that they publish, they put, you know, also online. You know, so you can download the digital version, because this book is really thick. It's 1,000 pages, you know, so it's a brick, you know.
All right, wonderful.
So you know, now it's in print, you know, it will appear just in a few weeks.
Okay, so I also have a question. So I work on, like, I'm a German studies scholar, and I work on German language literature about former Yugoslavia. So Maria Botrucic, Alida Premo, you mentioned Maya Hadelab. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. Same question at the emancipatory potential of the socialist past. So we're also doing a collection about that. But we're looking at the whole, like, socialist memory more broadly speaking, and I think a lot of the things you're saying resonate with us. So why did you choose just the 80s rather than, like, I mean, I think we also had a talk by Gal Curran before about the partisan counter archive and so on. So I was just wondering, what was did you also look a little bit more broadly, or just the 80s, or did you see your, like, idea that since the 2010s, that's the focus, not just on the 80s, but also how other parts of former Yugoslavia are remembered? Like, did you see that as well, or did you just focus on the 80s?
Yeah, of course, you know, on one side, you know, I'm very longue durée, you know, I'm cultural studies scholar, for professional sociologist of culture, you know, but, you know, my secret love is history all the time, you know, so everything must be, you know, historicized, as you know, Jameson is teaching us, you know, so historicize, always historicize, put everything, you know, in the larger perspective. So even the 80s, you know, were, you know, large enough, you know, so even when I was doing, you know, this, when I'm starting to, you know, really to focus, you know, on what, to write a text about it, you know, I was, you know, said, well, why I'm doing this, you know, because it's so much of it, you know, and of course I did also some other projects, you know, but, you know, 80s, it's obsession, you know, not only, you know, in ex-Yugoslavia, you know, there's a difference, of course, you know, about speaking about collective memory, nostalgia, you know, Retromania and so on, between, now speaking generally East and West, you know, there's kind of return also in the West, but, you know, in the East happened this, you know, also political break, you know, so there's a break in culture, break also in the cultural field and also in political field. In the West, there was no break on the political field, you know, so their nostalgia can be apolitical. We're just thinking about, you know, Eurythmics, you know, in the Depeche Mode and blah, blah, you know, without any connotations, you know, but here we have another story, you know, but this is a general, you know, everything, you know, this obsession with the 80s is much broader phenomena, you know. Check on MTV, you know, they have 5 channels. MTV's got 5 channels. One is only specialized on the 80s, you know. So much of 80s is going on, you know. I was just traveling, just came a few days ago from the States, you know, when I was I was have a transfer flight in Istanbul, you know, and what I was hearing there, you know, not some, you know, Turkish music, folk, whatever, you know, but, you know, the 80s, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, there are more eurythmics than not only local, but also, you know, songs from before and after, you know. So there was a world before and there is a world after, but this obsession with the 80s, you know, maybe this is also a generational issue. Maybe the guys in, you know, the people in, you know, getting into power, and they can afford, you know, to go back in times of their youth with, you know, to see things more, to reproduce things, you know, that back then, you know, was something that they lived through. But as I said, this is an obsession. And also when we are speaking about, I don't know, vintage, about the retro culture in fashion, in design, you know, most of it is returning back to the 80s. You know, I believe Natalia Maisova is here with us. You know, she's speaking about this return, you know, in digital culture, you know, digital nostalgia that refers back to the 80s, not to 70s, not to Janis Joplin, but to Einstürzende Neubauten. You know, this is very, very interesting, you know. The beginning of this, you know, retro element, you know, that comes that 80s in a way colonized, you know, this memories on the recent past. And again, also I did it for my selfish reasons, because as I said, you know, this was a time when I was young, you know, so I experienced them very and on different levels and in different senses, you know, very, very from close distance, you know. So it, you know, it is, you know, was also part of my education at that time, you know. So as I said, you know, I finished my BA when the first Slovenian government, still in Yugoslavia for 1 year, appeared, you know, but I always had the impression that I made 2 BAs, one in the faculty, in the school, in the university, and the second one out in the streets when the things are going on. Ljubljana was extremely vibrant and interesting place at the time to be, you know. So actually it was a double degree, you know. So this is one of the reasons again, you know, and it also speaks, you know, we all, not to bring autoethnography in, you know, but this is, you know, what we research is also what we are in one way or another, you know, in social sciences, in humanistic researches, you know, this is in humanities, this is also part of us, you know, so it's no wonder what we are doing, you know. Not to open the discussion about the autoethnography now, you know, but this is part of us. Thanks for the question.
Okay, other questions? I think Kate Vainola had a question. I'm not sure if I interpreted this correctly. Kate?
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I really liked the presentation also, so I
okay,
started to clap.
Okay, super, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, I have a question. I don't find the hand right now, but
yeah, please, Annika, go ahead.
yeah, thanks. Yes, thank you so much for this rich talk, and you continue from the last question. Actually, it's the way I have a comment and a question. Also from the perspective of Estonia and Baltic states, I think this difference between immediate post-World War II decades and the late socialists makes a lot of sense. And we have scholars of ethnologists who have studied life stories in the audience right now, who have shown how in the context of this politics of memory of anti-communism and so very, very black view of the whole Soviet period. Actually, in social memory, in life stories, people tend to also look positively on the late socialism and 80s in particular. But what is interesting, I think the diagnosis that you offered for Yugoslavia is less coherent here, because on the level of culture productions, we also see maybe nostalgia of 80s, but then it's always a resistance to like nostalgia of this punk culture and other things that are mostly seen as a resistance to the Soviet system. So you hardly find anything that looks at the 80s in terms of this emancipatory or mode or an alternative to what is now. So in that sense, it's very different. So my question is actually about comparisons, because what I found very interesting that you have like all these post-Yugoslav countries, and do you see any differences between them? This is the first thing I wanted to ask, and the second, more largely in Eastern Europe. Does it make sense and to compare and how? Because one of the questions you mentioned at the beginning was this, how continuity and discontinuity is seen, and so this is maybe a way to compare how this has been the big transition in the 90s has been seen, and but in general, because this is something very essential for our project. So if it makes sense to compare such different regions as Baltic states and Southeast Europe, and if so, how?
Well, thank you for the question. This is one of the crucial questions, in general. This is, comparison is one of the rare instruments that we have in social sciences. We cannot make experiments with people, with countries, and so on. This is for natural sciences. So, what this is one of the, of course, with all the reservations, comparison, historical comparison, and also, horizontal one, are one of the, rare, methods that we can, make more general, insights in the topics. Of course, with all reservations, we not compare. There's not a single person is similar to the other single. Is the same with the other similar person. In chemistry, in physics, everything can be the same. But even then, it's not that simple. If I may correct myself, So, of course, I believe that we have to compare because we don't have many other, tools, methods to do it, but we have to be very, very conscious, and be very, very reserved and very, very careful about it, So yes, and not only, reserved to our parts of the world, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and so on, but doing everything, on the all European and also global perspective. As I said, the hipster, vintage color, retro trends, this is something very global, but there are different, interpretations of it, different functions, I don't know, punk history is very different, class background of the punk in England was very different than it was in Eastern Europe, in Slovenia, and so on, but still, there's an element that we can compare, I don't know, punk music, and then we see how it developed here, how it developed there, and so, I'm not afraid to make comparisons, but, also, very, very cautious about it, I believe that we have to do both things at the same time. So see the differences and similarities. What is similar with the others and what are the differences? I know that it's very, some things are very different, the Baltic states, Balkan states on the other side, but I don't know, part of the history is still the same. Socialist regimes of this or the other type, being part of the larger state, Yugoslavia was very different from Soviet Union, but still it was part of one bigger entity than it is now. So as I said, I use comparisons, as one of the methods. Also, when I'm doing visual analysis, we have to compare. But as anthropologists taught us, compare the comparable. So what is comparable? Then it's the real point to discover, But yeah. We don't have many other, we don't have precise methods as in some other, and in some other fields, So yeah, I'm not afraid to compare, but extremely cautious about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we have another question from Aigi. Please, Aigi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mitja, for your excellent presentation. It was very interesting. And talking about comparisons, I'm currently reading a book by Sasa Stanisic, which was originally written in German. And well, when we're talking about the picture of Yugoslavia in the 1980s, what role might play the ex-Yugoslavian diaspora in Germany or in other countries? For example, the authors with ex-Yugoslavian background, are they well known in former Yugoslavian republics? Do they belong to the picture? Or is there any possibility to compare those authors which are still based in former Yugoslavia and the other countries all over the world? Is it comparable somehow, the works they write, or is it there isn't any possibility to compare those works?
Yeah, by definition, we have to compare, of course, and there are fantastic authors. You mentioned Stanisic, there's Hamon, there's Igor Štiks, for example, there are many others. Then there were, fantastic writers, essayists from Croatia, they were called witches in the beginning of the 90s, who were practically, forced to leave, like Dubravka Ugrešić, Slavenka Drakulić, and others, Daša Drnčić, my favorite Croatian writer, and so on. I don't see much differences. Well, first of all, they are well respected here in the region. In the beginning, of course, some of them were seen, as traitors, and they left, blah blah. And not mentioning, some other, scholars like, I don't know, Boris Buden and others who just left because they could not stand what is happening or in music, like, Johnny Štulić from one of the most popular bands, Azra. He just left. He said Yugoslavia is occupied, by the fascists. I have to leave, and he never returned. So, and he completely, he's not responding to letters. He's completely, enclosed his little world. I believe in Utrecht, in Holland, somewhere, and translating Greek classics or something. So he completely forgot about his rock past, And others for tragic stories of the band that I mentioned before, Katarina Velika. All the 3 original members, died in one way, in one tragic way or another. All these authors who left and are now they're writing in other languages like Hamon or Stanisic and others are well respected here. And they offer, they offer another perspective from, the outside, but also, they reinforce with their presence here in ex-Yugoslavia that we are not alone, that the nationalism did not win, the neoliberalism and all the values, that are positive, with many things that went wrong in those times. Don't get me wrong, but, appreciating things, that are now completely, as I mentioned before, completely, forgotten or even demonized, So again, ethnic plurality, social justice, the right for women, gay, lesbians, and so on, So I believe they bring a kind of confirmation also, besides their literary value, also kind of, they have also this, how to say, stimulating effect on the local writers. So I believe they're extremely important. And again, it's interesting that a lot of them, went abroad also, but not also outside of ex-Yugoslavia. There are a lot of people who just left from other countries, I don't know, from Bosnia to Serbia or to Slovenia and so on, and they continue their work there, and they contributed a lot to the local scene on all levels. I make the whole lecture here about how, for example, refugees from little kids that were coming here to already established, I don't know, scholars, writers, and so on, contributed to the Slovenian cultural scene, artistic scene, scholarly scene, So again, and this in a way, it's of course bad for their, countries back in other parts, of ex-Yugoslavia, but on the other side, they bring a kind of new solidarity in the region, that dismisses these absurd calls of, ethnic purity, homogenization, rule of neoliberal values and practices, and so on. So they are showing again, this is the political element of this production. It shows that another world was possible with good and bad sides, and it is possible also now. Kind of eye openers, in my view. At least this is how I interpret them.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes, other questions? Maria, please.
Yeah, sorry, I get very excited about that question as well with the German language one, obviously, so if I may, but I think I fully agree with you. It's so when I looked at the corpus earlier on, like anything before 2010, it was very much about working through the war, which worked in the German context, like Vergangenheitsbewältigung, whatever. So it was that dialogue between what the Germans did after the Holocaust versus what now we do, ex-Yugoslavs do with working through the war and the genocide in Srebrenica, right? So a lot of commonalities, but since 2010, it's really shifted, and a lot of the authors, even if it's the same, like Stanicic or Podrocic and the same authors, now they're really shifting towards this critique of neoliberal capitalism, I would say. Like you see that more and more with the younger authors that write, not the younger authors, just more recent books, because I think there's a generational issue in Germany as well, like born in the 80s or 70s, like, so I definitely see that shift since 2010 at least. I did a pretty big corpus there, and I think that's what's so fascinating, right? That the memory work we're doing now since 2010 is obviously more about our present moment than it is about the past. But very needed. So there's even one book by Alida Premo. She even brackets the war. Her whole fictional book, it's from 1918 to the present, 2014, and yet she refuses to talk about the war in this family generational history. And I think, my argument about that is because she's like, she doesn't want everything to just lead towards the war and the inevitable, dissolution of the project, and, socialism is bound to fail in history. But instead it's like, okay, she just brackets it out and say, let's look at Yugoslavia without the war, just for a moment. And I think maybe that's the 80s. That's what the 80s fascination is. The war hadn't happened yet, right? There was still state totalitarianism could end. There was hope for that, right? And then of course, capitalism took over, and that. So I don't know if you agree or not, but that's, I don't know.
There's another element. I agree completely with you. But there's another layer of this, and I believe in the last 10, 15 years, from 2000 on or late 2010s on, also the shift, from these big stories, and these traumas, war, unemployment, immigration, blah 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 blah. Sorry, it's not right to say, but more to everyday stories, more mundane, just little, everyday things, so kind of also return, to the topics that were before very, very tragic, before, was Romeo and Julia stories, ended in tragedy, and then there are success stories. People get together, get married, they go across, the boundaries, but, usual people, common people, not just, as I said, those who are involved in all this, really, terrible things that were going on in the 90s, and this reflects, as I said, you're mentioning literature, but also I believe, as I mentioned before with this Czarno-Bieli Svet, the black and white world, also in TV series and in music as well, appreciating, back then, everyday routine life and so on, in comparison to what is going on today. So it kind of, it's implicit, sometimes also explicit critique of what is going on today. So the critical reader, the critical listener would sense this. It was possible. So I don't know, social security things, that were so obvious. Housing, care for young people, helping them in the beginning, and things like that, So again, it's not black and white stories, of course, and in different parts of ex-Yugoslavia, let alone, the whole Eastern Europe. It's much, much broader, picture, and with a lot of controversies, but there are some elements, who are just repeating over and over in this production, this kind of fil rouge, and then it just, the perspectives can be different, from these big stories, to maybe a little bit more everyday, which are also interesting, dramas are everywhere. Also in personal life. So thank you. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yes, Anakin, were you?
No.
I thought you were about to say something, sorry. And any other questions? We are still open for questions. Now, then maybe I have just a brief question, practical question, Mitja. Is this talk, is it based on a paper that you have already published? Yes, okay.
I mentioned in the beginning, yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Serbo-Croatian and Hungarian, and it will be in English, just as I said.
Okay, okay, so this is part of this. Okay, because I was thinking I absolutely have to read this, because I am very much impressed with this amount and diversity of material that you mentioned in your talk, and I'm just really excited to see how you handle this sort of in practical.
Thank you. But in the beginning, of the text I'm writing, there's so many, there will be always someone, aha, you forgot this, what about, no. So as I said, there were really, dozens of books written, films, songs, so really I made to make, otherwise that would be a book in itself. Maybe this is a topic of the book, but I have also some other projects going on, but as I said, this idea of how this return of the 80s in arts and culture on different levels, exhibitions, you open the TV, you go, there's always this 80s, you go to buy milk, there's a nostalgic weekend, and everything, it's like, products are from those times, having, bringing all these memories back,
But I think it's extremely inspiring and always very impressive to see you handle all this material at once. Like you're never you don't allow, you're never limited just to literature or to music or to, whatever else, graffiti, but it just, you're not like overwhelmed and intimidated by this amount of material, but you find ways to handle it.
But it goes together. As I said, a lot of these books that I mentioned, are, kind of semi-biographies, speaking about their youth, about their first love, romances, blah, blah, but also music, went to that concert. So it's everything is connected, so it would be really, that would castrate the whole thing, if we would divide this only into, of course, with if I would be more focused, I could go much deeper into each of these, but I would try to make, what Enneke was mentioning before, kind of comparative, level, the level of comparison between all these fields, and there are much more connections, but also, again, in films, in series, there's much less enthusiasm than in music. Music is also very, how to say, corporal, it's more alive, so you don't, there's less tragic music that are tragic films or melodramatic and so on. Music is something very much more alive, more happy, more merrier, and so. But there are differences, but the element is very the structure, is sometimes surprisingly similar, sometimes even identical. I read already something about it. Yes, it's or listened or saw somewhere. Graffiti, for example. This is very interesting. We're doing an exhibition now in Belgrade. It will be opened next June 23. How Yugoslavia appears today, and anti-Yugoslavia and anti-Yugoslavia, so both, how they are appearing on the walls of post-Yugoslav cities, and really this is, fantastic, photos from Slovenia to Macedonia of, mentioning Yugoslavia. There are hundreds of graffiti, about Tito, about Yugoslavia partisans, and against them. So there's a lot of Yugoslavia out there in the streets, going, graffiti battles, graffiti wars, So again, we have partisans and the fascists, on both sides, so the red stars and swastikas, so again, everything is out there, so I didn't even mention graffiti, which would be also very interesting, but for some other time, maybe.
So thank you very much again, Mitja, for this super rich examples and very inspiring comparative ideas for our research.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone, to attending and participating in the discussion.